Well, let's turn this morning to the book of Genesis. We're still in chapter 32, and we're looking at this wrestling match that we've last couple of weeks here. Jacob and the stranger. It has been so much fun for me to be able to do this study. I've spent hours thinking about this, and there's just it is so it's so apparent what is going on, but yet there's so much mystery tied in to the details of the event. And this morning we're going to be intentional and take some time, because I'm going to make a suggestion this morning of how to look at this text. And you can take it for what it's worth, but it's my full intention to try to make sense out of this story and have the facts fit. And so in order to do that, that's what this piece is of. When we end today, it will be how to think about this text, how to think about what's going on in this man's life. Much more than just this conflict between two individuals and getting the absolute tar kicked out of you and then going from there. There's much more to this text, and that's what I want to look at this morning. So review is, I suggested last week that Jacob is carrying a wound. Several wounds, but it all envelops into one great wound. And that wound has been apparent in the story from time to time, and I identified four areas here that at least I thought of. And number one was the story of the purchased birthright. Well, what's behind that story is I didn't get what I needed. The only reason why in the story, the only reason to have to manipulate and deceive someone else to get something from them is the fact that you feel you don't have it. Thus, there was a wounding there. There's a wounding. It's driven by an unhealthy need. Number two, the stolen blessing. Well, there is where the idea that Jacob doesn't measure up is actually enforced by his mother, because the two of them contrived together to come up with this very complex plan of how to steal the blessing away from his brother. Again, underlying message there is, I don't measure up. And so I have to steal something in order to get what I feel is my share. The third thing that I identified was that period of time. Well, actually, the marriage, being duped by your father-in-law, tricked, and his obvious response of that was done to him. The first two he did, but this was done to him. I looked like a fool, and we all know that doesn't feel very, very good. Yeah, it really is. And we looked at that, but now he's on the receiving side of that. But there's a lot that has happened in this man's life, just like there's been a lot that has happened in our lives that have actually defined us as men. Number four, being stuck for years in the dead-end role. The years in Haran, where he's working for his father-in-law and contributing to his father-in-law's wealth, the dead-end street. And I think probably many of us can identify that. And of course, the question now at this age in his life is, why did I allow this to happen? Look at the years I have wasted in this whole thing here. So my screen got real big. I don't know how that happened. I don't get it. I don't get technology. I set this up this morning so we would frame in the corner and all that, and now here we are.
It's nice, we can read it.
Oh, I know why. Because I have it blown up. That's, interesting. I did not know that did that. I thought it maintained the same. Anyway, so what that has created was these feelings, and this is all out of my head here, feelings of anxiety, frustration, self-absorption, and I'm also transferring on things that I have, experienced. And the wound, our default mode as men, we try to hide it, we try to numb it, we try to manage it, we attempt to overcome it, and the overall goal of us now. So this whole thing is the wound here, and the goal here is to overcome this problem, this underlying sense of anxiety, and that things are not right, and I have to make them right, applying the word resistance. It's force. It's what we see happening in a wrestling match. It's what we see happening in life, is that in order for me to become everything I'm supposed to be, I have to use force in order to do it. That is the idea here. So we go on to the next slide, and maybe if I can get there. So what I've done is I've taken that previous slide and I've wrapped it with that border, and I've packaged it as this wound. Notice the wound, and the primary action in this is resistance. And this is what Jacob is bringing to this match. He's not bringing, actually, the match is coming to him. He has put himself, he's on a rock, he's in the middle of the night, he's done everything he can do. We spent weeks talking about that. He is alone, and now I believe something great is coming to him because he's put himself in a position to receive. That's the idea. And there's a huge amount of correlation. He's done with his activity. He's exhausted his gas tank. He has done everything, and now there's nothing left. Now is when he can listen. Now is when he can receive. And that's the idea. And all he has to offer is the wound. Just like you and I, when we find ourselves so exhausted and empty that we've given up. We've reached our limitation, and there is no other place to turn. We are in a great place to receive. You see the correlation? Yeah. So that's what he's bringing. So before we go into, I want to analyze, I suggested this a few weeks ago, but a wrestling match. And I thought of this slide last week, and I kind of, I put it down that, so in a typical wrestling match, two opponents, I'm talking about the real thing, they come together, and in this case, the one on the left is Jacob, and his energy force is at a certain level. His ability, he's coming there. Well, the stranger, or the opponent, is coming back, and they're applying force, and that force has to be enough to overcome the smaller arrow. So there is a greater force coming against. If it were equal force, they would just be moving back and forth. But that takes a huge amount of effort in order to apply that physical force. So then the next step is that opponent one, or Jacob, he has to, I'm not saying this is what happened, but this is how we think about wrestling. I'm just using the two, opponent one and opponent two. Opponent one then, on the left, he has to apply even a greater force to overcome opponent one's initial force. Do you see that? And so every time that thing happens where you ramp up, it draws a huge amount of energy, and all of us know, as Jim had said this morning, he's understanding how his energy is now becoming limited in your story. He said to me earlier, he said, I used to be able to do 12 and 14 hours of work. And he says now 4 hours is what caused him to sleep in this morning. So, and I think we can all understand that. There's this expending of energy. And so it just keeps ramping up and ramping up in the match. And guys, the reality is, in this whole thing, in a wrestling match, you can go about 6 minutes. That's what a high school wrestling match is. In college, it's 7 minutes. They have the first of 3 periods, 3 minutes, and then 2 2-minute periods. And any of you have ever wrestled, it is at the end of the match, it's absolute exhaustion. You are physically and mentally spent. The last thing you want to do is hold on to your opponent. There is no way. There is no physical way this can go on for more than 6 or 7 minutes if it is a conventional wrestling match, as the text seems to indicate. Okay? So, I want to read my thought. I'm doing some interpretive thoughts, and we're turning a corner here of how to think about this, and I'm submitting it to you. This is my response to my interpretation of verses 24 and 25. The language of the text appears to be that the stranger was attempting to overpower Jacob as in a conventional wrestling match, just like I've just explained. However, number one, I've got 4 points here. Number one, the match went on for several hours, proving that full resistance, as I depicted in this slide, full resistance was not part of this match because it is not physically possible to exert that level of force for that long. In other words, it went hours, not minutes. Does that make sense? Okay, you can buy that one then. Number two, when the stranger saw, when the stranger saw, that's in the text. He didn't say stranger, but when he saw, indicating a moment of realization. Is that what, Dick, is that what your text reads? When he saw.
I was reading a different spot.
Okay.
What?
When he saw he could not overpower. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, when he saw that he could not overpower him. Okay, so they're struggling for hours, and he saw at a certain moment. I'm interpreting that as a moment of realization, and at that moment of realization, he applied a force that wounded Jacob. Okay, and I don't think it was it was just maybe with his thumb. I don't. We have to assume. I think we have to assume the stranger could have applied that force at any time during the match. If that stranger comes out and can apply that level of force with such little effort, that little force but huge impact. You know, it wasn't a blow to the face, it was a touch. And that touch had so much power. And I think it is a safe assumption that we could think that this opponent, this stranger, could apply that at any moment during the wrestling match. So why this moment? It ties back to the fact that he saw. He was observing his opponent during this entire match. And at the opportune time, when he saw that we are turning a corner, when the opponent stranger, saw that Jacob was ready. He saw that Jacob was ready. He applied the force that wounded Jacob. Then note, fascinating, no recoil. You know, a blow to the face, recoil. Hit to the rib. I mean, the wrestling, it's not fair you can't hit anybody when you're wrestling. But think about the inducing of pain. There's always a recoil on the other side. There is no recoil, so much so if we skip ahead, we cheat, we go ahead, we look at verse 26, says that Jacob, opposite of recoil, he could not let go. So it had no wounding effect like we think of a wound. We think of a wound as pain. This did not have pain because there was no recoil in the text. And then lastly, number 4. Therefore, in my opinion, the language of the text is merely the language of appearance. That the contest went on and on for a period of time. Jacob would not quit, and this leading him to an end goal to place Jacob where he needed to go. That this was all for Jacob's benefit. Jacob was in a moment, he was in a place to receive. The stranger came to him, not in the sense to overpower him, but to work with him, to observe him, to be with him, to connect with him. And at that opportune time when Jacob was ready, the touch, which did something wonderful that we're going to look at. Okay. Do you see my point there? Okay. All right. So how do we explain this? This is my attempt. That now I put not 6 minutes, but I put 6 hours. 6 hours plus or minus. And that 6-hour wrestling match did not end in parting, but it ended into a desire for more, which is amazing. So how do you explain this? Stranger, Jacob, this interaction right here. They endured all night. And no, I know you can't see this, but right here is where I shrunk the previous slide way down, 6 minutes as compared to 6 hours. You know, that something other was happening than a conventional force going back and forth and trying to overpower the other individual. That's what this is. And so how do we look at it? Here is my interpretation. It's the word connection. Right here. It's the word connection. Versus separation. Resistance. It's all about connection, which is a way different way to think about this match. Way different. We think of two people going at it because this is so ingrained in our head, and trying to overpower, and when the stranger saw he couldn't overpower, he just touched him and wounded him, and that whole thing is just so filled with enigma and mystery. Well, the way that I'm interpreting is it wasn't about overpowering at all. It was about allowing Jacob needed to wrestle. And the stranger was accommodating that need to a point where it ended in something wonderful happening that didn't cause recoil, but caused further embrace and connection. I see connection here. You got to let me go. No, I'm not going to let you go. Yes.
Mike, it just seems like the text is reinforcing what you are talking about, that Jacob was wounded or lacking or something like that because he's asking God to bless him. It's almost like the first blessing from his father didn't take.
It didn't take, no.
Or
That's a really...
there was no evidence,
Mhm.
at least in Jacob's heart, there wasn't evidence that he felt like he was blessed, maybe because it was stolen.
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting and right on that he walked all these years of life and he didn't have what he needed to be at peace. There's something that needed to happen. And this is a key moment for this to happen. So we're not talking about resistance anymore, quite the opposite. We're talking about connection. Two parties in the same match, but two different objectives. And that's what this slide shows here. Okay, so now we've got two slides with this barrier in between. Jacob brings woundedness, and I'm suggesting, here's the corner that I'm hoping that we can turn here. The stranger is bringing connection. connection. Okay. So, as we look at this, there are three things we're going to look at. And I don't know how far we'll get today, but I want us to look at what is it about this connection? What are we talking about here? What would cause a man who needed to wrestle and to exert energy and force and working at that level with in that close, face to face? Notice as the as the image shows, they're grappling and they're applying force, but this other stranger, the opponent, has a totally different objection, or objective rather, not an objection, but it's connection. And how do you reconcile these two? Right now we got these two ideas that we're working with, and so that's what we want to talk about. I'm going to do the what, the who, and I think the last one is the why. We're not going to get to all three. But the what of this interaction, the what is number one. And I'm using the word empathy. I'm going to play a short clip here from a woman I really like to listen to. Her name is Brené Brown. And I don't know if I've played any of her clips here. She's done some TED Talks, and she did a talk on vulnerability on TED Talk that went viral, and it's an amazing piece of work about human interaction. So you could write down Brené Brown vulnerability, and it'll take you right there. But she's a really good speaker. Well, this is a little cartoon, and it's about this idea of empathy. And so number one, as we're casting this idea of connection and trying to understand connection, the first, think of it as the large sphere, is the what. What we see happening in this story is empathy. Okay? And so, we're going to see if we can play this. It's just a short little video. We'll probably just do this one today before we go on to number two. But can you hear it?
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wachman is a nursing scholar whose professions, very diverse professions, where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize it as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in people and then communicating that. Is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space where some kind of in a deep hole, and they shout out and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, whew, it's bad. No. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. At least you're pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least he's an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, man, I don't understand why the audio is, but that's beside the point. I'll work on that.
I think it has to do with the speed.
Do you?
Yeah, I think it's buffering and then it feeds it through and then it buffers again and feeds it.
The old buffer problem.
Buffer.
So I want to get back to the, I have noticed this iPad really slowing down, and I'm wondering if it's just all this graphic stuff. But anyway, that's beside the point. And I want to get to this sometime. So Brene Brown is talking about empathy. And the way that she is talking about empathy is in contrast to another word, sympathy. And she's trying to, she's trying to cast these two ideas. And I don't know if you could hear, because of the audio was cutting out, but she makes a statement right at the beginning with the two circles where she defines the two and contrasts the two. And she says, empathy fuels what? Connection. Okay, and of course that word right there makes it apparent why I chose this video, because and why I'm thinking about empathy. Empathy fuels connection, contrasting her comment, secondly, when she had the circle of sympathy. She said sympathy drives, I think it cut out, disconnection. Sympathy drives disconnection. And then she builds her case by showing the big bear and then the other animal. I don't know what the other animal was.
Fox.
What's that?
Fox.
Okay, a fox. Are you sure it was a fox?
Yeah. The one that needs empathy was a fox.
Yeah,
right?
but
the one
there was
showing sympathy was like a deer or a gazelle.
yeah, and I don't get all that. Okay. Yes. So it shows the contrast. So what is the deer, the gazelle, is showing the sympathetic response. What are some of the things you picked up in the video?
At least.
At least. Okay, yeah, and she said, I had a miscarriage, and you couldn't hear the response. That one really shocked me. Well, at least you could get pregnant. And what is behind that at least? What's behind it, and have you ever experienced it?
Trying to balance the negative with the positive.
Yeah. God, and especially as believers, tragedy happens to an individual, and we give them a Bible verse. What's the big default Bible verse? Oh, jeez. All things work together for good. Well, thank you so much. I used that once when I was a very young man. I was in my former boss. I just become a zealot Christian, and my boss at the time, I was thinking about this week. He lost his brother, died tragically, and I sent them a card. At least I sent a card, but in there it said, and all things work together for good. And it was, I wasn't in it. I didn't know. But again, this innate desire to create the silver lining. We are uncomfortable with pain. We want to fix it. Okay, I'm suggesting that is our human default mode. Brene Brown ties that default mode to showing sympathy, in her words. I've never cast sympathy in that light, but that's, regardless, it doesn't matter. But she's using the word empathetic, which is the idea of connection and feeling with. And that is how I'm choosing to see this wrestling match, is the stranger is empathetic. Going through this painful interaction, imagine two sweaty guys, and even though they weren't exerting 100% force, they got sweaty. I know they. And imagine, grabbing this guy, this Jake, with his hairy back and his sweaty armpits and the odor and all of this, and going through a painful interaction for hours and hours in order for the full benefit to feel with Jacob. And the reason that now is the time is because Jacob was ready for this. Last week's title was Ready to Wrestle. And it's the same as you and I in our lives. At some point, I would say, we have been or we will be ready to wrestle with the realities of our past, of who we are, of who we think we're supposed to be. We realize our limitations, our frailties, how we have screwed things up, and we've kicked ourselves over and over. Only if I would have. And at this point, when we become totally exhausted and our tank is empty, we're ready to wrestle. And there is one who is there, who will come to us, maybe by night, and allow us to give us the grace to connect with us and to feel with us in a way that is beyond belief. And through that process, something changes. Next week we'll go on.
Thank you, Mike.